That's me. Not going to go through this, I did it earlier, but if there's anything that catches your eye, you can always ask me later. And you'll understand why dogs is in the bulleted list tomorrow. So don't miss that. I always like to begin with something humorous. This is a sign from Ontario Hydro in Ontario telling you that you're not allowed to drown. Okay, thank you, Ontario Hydro. Why are radiation accidents important to us? Apart from the people that experience the accidents, this is why. If there is a radiation accident, over here, release of radioactive material, it gets into the air, it gets into the atmosphere, it gets into precipitation, and then it gets into the environment. And once it's in the environment, it can get into things that you use or consume, whether eating or drinking or sitting next to. And we will see examples of that as we go through. So finally, of course, it's this one over here that we're interested in, the effect on humans in general, not necessarily the people involved in the accidents. And that's where a lot of the follow-up gets directed to, looking at all those people around whatever happened. All right, this is one of the first. I used to work here. This is Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and many people don't know it contributed to the Manhattan Project. They were producing plutonium at Chalk River Nuclear Labs. And in those days, it was a sealed town. There's the guard outside the fence. But in 1952, the reactor, which is shown over here, this is the reactor, that circular thing. There was a core meltdown. There was an internal explosion within that reactor, and it only took 62 seconds. Cooling water, of course, is one of the things that keeps the reactor running properly. That got out, and it got out into the floor of the reactor building and contaminated the reactor building, exposing everybody that was in that building to some radiation. It had to be cleaned up. Does anybody recognize this individual over here? Indeed. He was in the Navy, and he was one of the participants in cleaning up. The Americans came up to help us to clean up the mess that was made there. Over on the left, you can see how they were protected. Over in the middle, you see him on a submarine, because that's where he served. In a team of 3, he was sent in to do a job that lasted 1 minute and 29 seconds. That was his allowance of radiation dose. And he did test for internal radioactivity for some considerable time thereafter. How old is Jimmy Carter? Is radiation good for you? I rest my case. It took them 2 years to get the NRX back in operation. They had to take the old calandria out, which was that circular thing that you saw on the previous picture. They had to take it out and they had to bury it. And they had to put a new one in. So that was quite a serious accident. This is Windscale in United Kingdom. This was also 1957. And there was a problem here. The problem was things caught on fire, and the fire released the radioactive materials that you see there up on the screen. And that burned for 3 days. What was released? Well, you can see iodine-131, cesium-137, polonium-210, ruthenium-106, and xenon-133, which is a gas. Huge amounts were released. These prefixes, terabecquerels and petabecquerels, a terabecquerel is shown down at the bottom of the screen for you here. That's how big a terabecquerel is. Now, what's a becquerel? I don't expect you to tell me. I'm going to tell you, of course. It's 1 transformation per second, 1 decay per second. So that's how many decays are taking place from the radioactive material. Lots. So that's a lot of activity that came out. Most of it was uranium as well that came back down. And interestingly, it was like snowflakes. Some of them quite large, up to 25 centimeters in size. But that came down into the local community. So that was a real problem. The highest dose was to the thyroid of people. The dose is shown there, it's 100 milligray. Let's put that in perspective. Your background dose every year is 3 milligray. So about 30 times background was the dose to the people, for the thyroid. 53 years later from this publication, looking at the people that were around the wind scale accident, there were no health effects found. So despite the fact lots of activity got out and that there were some significant doses to people's thyroids, no long-term effects from wind scale. This is Kishtim in the USSR, again in 1957. Seems to be a stellar year for accidents, doesn't it? September. This took place in Chelyabinsk 40. Chelyabinsk 40 was a secret town in the Soviet Union in those days and was primarily used for producing plutonium for weapons, for nuclear weapons. A storage tank exploded there and released, the explosion was somewhere in the region of 70 to 100 tons of TNT, that's the equivalent explosion, and it released quite a lot of plutonium. The picture over on the right shows you where the contamination went. So Chelyabinsk is down here, and off it went. So that's the area that was contaminated. About 300 kilometers of area was contaminated, and you can see narrow beam there, just the wind pattern. Whenever there's an aerial release, we're very much at the mercy of the weather, and you'll see how that comes out when I start talking about Chernobyl. Again, pettabecquerels. I've given you the amount down there. That's the amount that was released. Huge amount of plutonium. We'll be talking about plutonium in several of these accidents. Kishtim still. Also with the plutonium, we had the other nuclides listed up there released, but the one of greatest concern is strontium-90. Strontium-90 has a half-life of about 30 years, and unfortunately it behaves in the human body like calcium. It gets into cow's milk, for example. It goes down to the grass, the cows eat it, and it goes into their milk. So milk is contaminated. A lot of foodstuffs can be contaminated because it follows calcium through the environment. And as you can see, they had to close all the stores that had milk and meat, and new supplies had to be brought in, but it was 2 days afterwards. The picture here is of the evacuated area, because they did evacuate people from this area where this took place. A blow up of this. About 10,000 people were evacuated, and about 260,000 remained in less contaminated areas. There is always a trade-off between evacuating and staying in a lesser contaminated area. And the reason for this is evacuation is actually very stressful. And that evacuation process itself, and leaving everything behind, can cause as many problems as you might get by staying there and getting exposed to some radiation. And I said that in the last bullet. Again, some more pictures from that area. But over on the right, of course, we have something much more significant that we'll deal with in a minute. Again, 3 millisieverts per year is the background. Now I've changed units there. Milligray, millisieverts, essentially the same thing. When you're thinking about this, one's a physical unit, one's a biological unit, if you might like, and millisieverts includes a health risk, as milligray does not. You can see the average external dose was 170 millisieverts, many times higher than background dose, so these are significant numbers. The average internal dose in the first year was about 1.5 sieverts. That's a big dose. That can cause problems. That being said, after 30 years, it's estimated that the internal dose was a much smaller number, 20 millisieverts, and anything less than 100 millisieverts, according to the Health Physics Society of America and many other international organizations, there are going to be no noticeable health effects once you're below that number of 100 millisieverts. So 20, that means everybody who got that wasn't having a problem. Rocky Flats, Colorado. In America now, Rocky Flats was one of the places that was involved in plutonium production for the Manhattan Project, and also then responsible for recycling and purifying warheads for the nuclear program in the United States. And plutonium is known as, and I will address this a little bit later, but it is known as the deadliest substance known to mankind. Remember that for when we get to when I tell you it's not the deadliest substance known to mankind. But you often see that from anti-nuclear people that it is. So what is Rocky Flats? It's 15 miles from Denver, as the slide shows. The picture over on the right shows you the plan of it. There were over 2 million people living in the area of Rocky Flats, so if there's a significant accident there, there's a lot of people that could be affected by whatever comes out of Rocky Flats. And there were just under 5,000 people working in Rocky Flats. That was in 1995. But before that, they had two fires in 1957 and 1969. And they tried to keep, certainly the first one, they tried to keep that secret. They didn't want that information getting out. The 1969 one was a little better known. And there was also leakage of plutonium-contaminated oils later on in 1964. So they weren't doing necessarily a great job. In fact, the way they were handling plutonium was pretty slapdash. Because one of the things that happened to that, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's talk about the fires. 1957, 13 hours it burned, and we had up to 20 kilos of plutonium being vaporized and going up into the atmosphere. 30,000 gallons of contaminated water escape. That can go into the aquifers. People can get that in their drinking water, so that's not good. And despite the fact that some of the buildings were heavily contaminated with plutonium, those in charge deemed it possible for their workers to go back to work. So you get an idea of the safety culture in Rocky Flats, right, during these days. Much better now in nuclear facilities, I must say. Some of the team that worked it over there, this is the 1969 fire. Again, another plutonium fire. They had it out in the atmosphere, and sometimes if it's very finely divided, plutonium will spontaneously ignite, and this is what happened in this case, and several kilos burned in this event. They found background radiation some 300 times what it should have been, and they also found plutonium had got out to the boundary of the site, indicating that maybe it had got off-site as well. Epidemiological studies were performed. You see over on the left an approximation of a plume that came out of Rocky Flats. The information was not reliable. The accuracy of that plume is not reliable, but nonetheless, the epidemiology looking at people's health didn't find any increase in health effects, detrimental health effects, which was, in my opinion, lucky, because it could have been much worse. First time one agency in the USA investigated another agency in the USA. The FBI raided Rocky Flats. They snuck in, pretending to be informants, saying eco-terrorists were coming, until the bulk of the FBI could get there. At least 70 agents went there and raided the place. And one of the reasons they were doing it, because there were stories, multiple stories, of how Rocky Flats was avoiding environmental regulations. And in fact, over the operation lifetime, they managed to lose, get this, over 1,100 kilos of plutonium. How do you lose 1,100, well, almost 1,200 kilos of plutonium? The FBI found plutonium all over the place where it wasn't supposed to be. This was basically the beginning of the end for the Rocky Flats, and what we see on the left is Rocky Flats as it was, and what we see on the right is Rocky Flats today. It's gone. It was completely decommissioned, erased. There were charges brought against some of the executives, but in fact, they were never charged. As I said, gone, decommissioned in 2005. This is Palomares, Spain. A B-52 armed with 4 nuclear warheads that had radioactive material in them, plutonium. You're nodding your head. Were you on the plane? No, you're just nodding your head. Okay. He remembers. Do you remember it? Oh, were you? How interesting. You can tell me some stories later. Right, so there was a collision in the air, and the B-52 dropped its bombs. They came down. They did not detonate in the true sense of the word. There were no atomic explosions because they weren't armed for that. And we've got 4 warheads on the ground in Spain, in Palomares, and you see one of them over here on the right. 2 of them were easy to get. One landed in the water, one landed on the beach. That was easy, go pick it up, and there we go. And that was safe. So no incident at all in recovering 2. But we still got 2 more. So what happened to the other 2? Well, the high explosives in them actually went off. So the bomb detonated, but not as an atomic explosion, it detonated. So it spread material around. Radioactive material was spread around. One was in the low mountains west of the town, and one was on agricultural land to the east. So this now is a challenge, because you don't just pick up the warhead itself, the bomb, you've now got to pick up the contamination that got out of it. So this is the job, to pick it all up. And that's indeed what they did. So the contamination spread over 2 square kilometers. Think about that, 2 square kilometers, you've got to clean all this up. Over 1,000 cubic meters of soil had to be picked up, packed in 55-gallon drums. It took 747 workers 8 weeks to do this, to bring the soil back to the original condition, or at least close to the original condition that it was in. In other words, low background, if not absolutely no radioactivity at all. Now, and don't forget, everything is actually radioactive, so you can't clean things up completely, because there's natural radioactivity in the ground anyway. So when I say they cleaned it up, there's still stuff there, but it's naturally occurring. There was no plutonium contamination found in the 100 residents that they looked at, but because cleaning it up, dressed in PPE, personal protective equipment, looked sinister, the Spanish government said, no, you shall not wear it. So the actual people doing the work of cleaning it up were exposed, because they weren't allowed to wear it, and they got some internal contamination. The 4th area where it was couldn't be cleaned up. You see the kind of condition over here. I mean, you can't clean this up. This is a mountain. It's very hard to do that. So it was left in, it was basically fenced off. Don't go there. It's not safe. There's radioactive material spread over the soil there. So despite the warnings, of course, they are now using that land. That's gone away. 6 years afterwards, though, and the study is in Broken Arrow in the document shown over on the right. It's declassified. You can read it if you so wish. They found that there was no problems in the community with a 6-year follow-up, and so nobody was exposed in the general public. So of the 714 persons that were examined in 1988, we had 124 that had plutonium above the NDL. That is the minimum detection limit, so they did have plutonium inside of them. Deadliest substance known to mankind. Well, this is where we debunk that. The second bullet debunks that. Botulism toxin is actually the deadliest substance known to mankind, and it has, as you can see, in the weight of a penny, 52 million lethal doses. Nowhere near. Plutonium is nowhere near as toxic as this. In fact, radium is more radiotoxic than plutonium. There's actually quite a few other radioactive materials that are more radiotoxic than plutonium. So if you ever hear plutonium is the most toxic thing known to mankind, have a good laugh, because they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Now we need to move to Mars Bluff in South Carolina in 1958. Well, they just missed the year. A year earlier it would have been, 4. They dropped an atomic bomb on this place. Fortunately, there was no warhead in the bomb, so it was just the bomb that came down, an empty bomb that got thrown. And you could see it in the headline there, in the Mars Bluff. Over on the right here, there was a house that got damaged by the bomb, and there's the bomb crater over there. 6 people were actually injured when that came down, but this is a conventional explosion, not a nuclear explosion. Again, you can see the damaged house here. You can see the damage on it. The car was damaged. The crater was about 23 meters in diameter, which is over there. So despite the fact a nuclear weapon that was actually dropped on the place, it wasn't a nuclear explosion. Thank goodness for that. That's the size of the device that was dropped. They're not small. Little Boy and Fat Man were big devices, which you can see the size of that one. 3 Mile Island. Who remembers 3 Mile Island? Oh, lots of you. Was anybody there? No? Okay, nobody was there. Interestingly, I had a colleague that I worked with when I was in my working life, and one of his ancestors owned the land where that reactor was built. Interesting coincidence. There's 3 Mile Island over on the right. 1979, an accident took place in Unit 2 and radioactivity got out, but it was a good design. The containment building did what it was supposed to do. It contained things. So despite what the media was telling you, there was no real excursion of radioactive material. It was a problem, of course, how this actually occurred. Human error. 3 of them in a row, actually. So an emergency feed in the first case didn't work because they left a valve closed when it should have been left open. So that caused a problem. It caused a pressure buildup. Then the emergency water injection, again, another operator error. In that case, they reduced the flow because when the pressure built up and the heat went up, this water valve should have come in, it should have been open, more water come in and more cooling so that there wouldn't have been an overheating in the reactor. Well, they reduced the flow, so the heating got worse. And then as the water overheated, then they drained water from the area. And so instead of having more source feed to help cool, there was less source feed, so it got worse again. And there was an overheating problem in the reactor building, but as I said, the containment area made it was okay. So the fuel heats up and partially melts, and we got radioactive material coming into the coolant, which is no good. And then that coolant got out, and it got into the floor of the reactor. And there was actually a hydrogen bubble that was created in the reactor building, and there was fear that there was going to be an explosion from that, but that didn't happen. And you can see some of the news there. There was a little bit that got out, actually. Xenon-133 got out. It's a gas. And also iodine-131 got out. It's also a gas. And you can see the amounts there, 370 petobecquerels, lots and lots and lots of becquerels because the number's down there. Big number, as you can see. Oh, a lot of zeros after that one. Now, the thing about xenon is it's a gas. So it goes up into the atmosphere. And the other thing about iodine, when it comes out, it's very reactive. And that's exactly what it did. It reacted with the concrete and it didn't go anywhere. So it stayed pretty much within the facility. The other thing too, that news probably forgot to tell you, is the half-life of xenon's 5 days, and the half-life of iodine's 8 days, meaning every half-life, half of it goes away. So after 5 days, half the xenon's gone. After 10 days, 3/4 of it is gone, and so on and so forth. Typically, we say after about 8 to 10 half-lives, there's nothing left, because it's all decayed away. And that's what that did. It decayed away very quickly. The average dose was measured to the public there within 80 kilometers around the site, and it was found to be 0.015 millisieverts. Remember, background dose is 3. That's way below background dose. And the highest dose wasn't even 1 millisievert. So it wasn't even a third of the background dose. So absolutely no effect whatsoever to anybody around 3 Mile Island. Members of the general public were not affected at all. However, boy, did they get scared. So we didn't lose much. I talked about the hot iodine, and it reacted with stuff around that got onto the concrete. I said that there were no radiation effects reported in the public. When they examined everybody at these low doses, you don't see anything. There's no way you can estimate anything. But that last bullet, the psychological effects, yes, there certainly were, because people were terrified of it. In the pictures down below, we see some cleanup operations, and in the picture on the left, who do we see in the picture on the left? Jimmy again. So radiation is good for you because he got to be, and he's still with us. Go and get exposed. Participate in a radiation accident. Jimmy says so. Okay, it's tongue in cheek, all right? Another study came out some time ago. This was from PSU, and they were trying to link, in 1975, they were trying to link an increase in thyroid cancer around 3 Mile Island to this event, but unfortunately, no, it was very controversial, and they came out with a very unconvincing case, actually. But nonetheless, TMI is closed. It was closed in 2019. And again, we see Jimmy over on the right doing a tour of the control room of 3 Mile Island. So what do we learn from this? We learn that we have to be accurate in talking about what gets out. We learn that we have to keep the news media informed properly, because if you don't tell them anything, they make it up. And I'm sure we're all familiar now with news media making stuff up. It wasn't as bad in those days as it is now, but nonetheless, you need to tell the news media what's going on if you want to get the right story out. And of course, we have to try and educate the news media so they understand what we're telling them. Otherwise, they still make it up. All right. SL1. Has anybody heard of SL1? Oh my God. 2 of you. It's the worst reactor accident in the United States. How do you know? Okay, and how do you know? You're a CIA plant, aren't you? Yeah, probably, because he's not actually admitting it. He can neither confirm nor deny. Is that right? Did I get the language right there? Very good. This is SL1 in January 1961. They were trying to mess around with one of the control rods. They were trying to restart it. They removed a rod too far out of the reactor, and the reactor went critical. What does that mean when a reactor goes critical? It means the reaction inside gets uncontrolled, it heats up, and the core melted. And in fact, it melted and vaporized, and the excursion, the explosion, and the steam release happened anywhere from 2 to 4 seconds. So boom, they took this rod out and boom, 3 men in there. The 13-ton vessel itself jumped up just under 3 meters. Think about that, 3 meters, the whole thing up about 3 meters. So what happened to these 3 guys inside? You can probably guess. They died. So they did. They were between the ages of 22 and 27, as shown here. Water spray that came out killed one straight away, and then another one was severely injured, and then a shield plug also came out and impaled one of the workers up on the ceiling. Oh, it gets worse. Could it get worse? All right. Well, why did this happen before I get to how it got really worse? It wasn't well designed. The fact that you could remove one control rod out and the reactor go critical, that's not a good design. So a bad design in SL1 is basically the problem with this. And there's a film by it actually too. So the poor guy that was impaled on the ceiling of the reactor building was stuck there for 6 days. He was not alive for 6 days, he was dead, okay? His body was pinned to the ceiling for 6 days. And why 6 days? Because it was so radioactive inside, they didn't know how to get in and get him down. They didn't find him either. They probably didn't go in and look because it was so radioactive, right? Yes. The gentleman there knows more than he's letting on. All right, we're going to be talking to you. The red circles show you the locations. There's a body there, there's a body up here, and there's a body there up on the ceiling. That's where he was stuck. The graves of the 3 men were in concrete and also lead-lined coffins. This is Legg's grave that you see there. He was the one that was stuck to the ceiling of the reactor building. That's the worst reactor accident in the United States. Why did it happen? There's a number of different reasons why we think it happened. I've listed them here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of the most interesting ones is that perhaps there was a love triangle going on, and this was an intentional attempt to kill the people. Well, it didn't work because all of them died. Bottom line is we don't actually know. If you look at the study, if you look at the work logs, we don't know why this occurred. This is the gravesite of SL1. There's the gravestone and the stones behind it, and it's buried. Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. A therapeutic source of cobalt got into scrap metal, and it was turned into metal furniture. What are you shaking it for? Well, I almost said that. I almost said that. I think that's a different one. That's a different one. We're getting to that one. Yes, do that. Right, where was I? So thousands of tons of steel got contaminated with this, and over 1,000 people got about a quarter of a millisievert. 700 got between 5 and 250, and 80 got somewhere between 250 and 3,000. Remember, background is 3. So anything above 3 we care about. Anything under 100 though, we're not going to see any medical effects. Despite these numbers that look horrific there were no deaths that we could relate to this. It was actually picked up in a truck going past external detectors, I think, by Los Alamos. That's how that was discovered. This is Chernobyl. We know about Chernobyl in 1986. What a disaster that was. It put the nuclear industry back decades because of this. Let's go through it. It's located just on the border of Ukraine and Belarus, as shown in the picture over on the right. The RBMK 1000 reactor was known to be unstable at low power, but for whatever reason they decided they wanted to do an experiment at low power. And to make sure that nothing interfered with the experiment at low power, they turned off all the safety features. And the experiment went wrong. And the fire took place. It all says that. Fuel temperature went up, it went above the melting point of uranium, and there was a fire, steam explosion, and it burned and it burned. 3 days after the explosion, the radioactivity was finally discovered in Scandinavia, in monitoring stations in Scandinavia, and when the news broke, Russia had to finally admit that they had an accident. They were trying to keep it quiet. Didn't work. And that fire burned for a long time. This is the remains of the reactor building. And you can see the explosion, how it blew the roof off, and there was a fire there that raged until it had consumed what was inside. It's still highly radioactive. It's now under a sarcophagus. We'll talk about this. Over on the right, here, this cloud that you see going over the surface of the Earth, that's radioactive contamination. It literally went absolutely everywhere, eventually, even into the southern hemisphere. You can detect something coming out from Chernobyl there. All of the graphite burned up, and of course that helped, and total release was even higher, 10 to the 18 becquerels. That's a 1 with 18 zeros behind it of material came out. That's the total amount, as you see, iodine-131, cesium-134, cesium-137, as well as other things. And as I said, it went absolutely everywhere. 2,000 plant workers and firefighters suffered acute radiation syndrome because they were dashing in, trying to throw things into the fire to put the fire out. They were up on the roof of the building and they were getting high doses of radiation. Within 3 months, 30 people died from radiation exposure, and 15,000 were reported to have lost the ability to work through disease that was caused by radiation. So a lot of people were affected by this. That being said, despite the fact the internet says somewhere between 48,000 and 200,000 would die as a result of Chernobyl, the World Health Organization predicts that only 4,000 will ever die of what happened here. Still a big number, but much less than the anti-nukes would have you believe. And this is an individual in the bed here are being monitored for internal radiation with 2 detectors above. Unfortunately, worldwide, there were up to 100,000 abortions of women that were scared of radioactivity getting in and affecting the fetus, and they were unnecessary. But that's what fear does, unfortunately. This shows you in time, as a percentage of the radiation level going out to 10,000 days, what the major constituents are. And as you can see, when we get out to long term here, that line up there is cesium-137 with a half-life of 30 years. So it really depends on the time since a radiation accident, what you're concerned about. And that changes with time. And the cesium-137 is something that we are concerned with. This is how cesium-137 moved through Europe as carried by the weather. So depending on which way the wind went, depending when it rained, we got cesium precipitating down in various areas. And at one point you couldn't eat certain foods. At other points you couldn't go into certain areas. But of course, as time has gone by, this is now largely changed. There was advisories up here to the Laplanders not to eat reindeer meat for quite some time, because the cesium would come down, it would go onto the lichen, the reindeer would eat the lichen. That's a straight food chain from lichen, reindeer, people. So they were warned not to do that. Also in Scotland, they were warned not to have sheep for a while, not eat sheep. These are some of the remains of it. This is Pripyat. So some of the side effects, if you like: radiophobia, really bad radiophobia worldwide, poor diet in the people that were in that area, a lot of alcoholism, that increased as a result of this. What we did find, which was really surprising, was a drastic increase in thyroid cancer amongst children. And part of the reason for that was the iodine deficient diet of the people, the children up there. So they would absorb more of the iodine that came out than normal. And we did see that. Pripyat was evacuated. There was a 30-kilometer evacuation zone. 116,000 people were evacuated from that area. And as you can see, 200,000 people in the initial cleanup got about 100 millisieverts. 100 millisieverts, you won't see any health effects. So they're okay. 786 settlements in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine had strict control zones for a while. That went away. Food consumption was limited. We were testing mushrooms in Canada that came from Europe to make sure they weren't too radioactive, for example. And the average dose in settlements in that time was 37 millisieverts, well below the 100 millisieverts limit, but 10 times, almost more than that, of the background dose, but nonetheless, no health effects from that. Some pictures of what it looks like today, deserted. You can actually take tours of this area if you're brave enough. This is the red forest. It turned red for a while. It was completely destroyed by the radiation that came out from the reactor. This is the sarcophagus that was very expensive, and it seals up the remains there because it's still radioactive, and there's still misinformation coming out about that. But one of the things that came out of Chernobyl is this lady here who's sitting in the front row, and that's my wife. And if it hadn't been for Chernobyl, we would not have met. So there's a bright spark in that dark period. If it wasn't for Chernobyl, we wouldn't be together. All right, this is the one you're thinking of, Goiânia, Brazil. This is the therapeutic unit that was abandoned. They didn't follow regulations, and there was a cobalt-60, cesium-137 source in it, not cobalt-60 in this case, in Goiânia. The source was quite strong, 50 terabecquerels. It was cesium chloride. They took it home, they broke it open, and cesium chloride at these levels glows. And they covered their arms with it, they painted themselves in it, they glowed at night, they were having fun with it. It was recognized when one of them got sick. He went in to see the doctor didn't know, he sent him to another doctor who, for some reason, had some idea, and then it was recognized what it was. So, over 100,000 people ended up getting tested and monitored. We found 7 highly contaminated. We found quite a few different areas contaminated, and beyond the actual escape of the source, everything that followed is a classic example of what might happen if a radiological device was used. In other words, a dirty bomb. So everything else from once that material got into the community, it's like a dirty bomb case. So there's Goiânia in the middle there. 250 people were found to be exposed, 129 internal, external, 21 had to get medical treatment, 10 were seriously overexposed and were in hospital. 4 of those died, and one of them, you can imagine, it's the radioactive material on the arm. They had to cut the arm off because of the radiation damage from the cesium. Contamination found all over the place, even on banknotes. They had to test all of those banknotes. Of the 10 million currency bills they tested, they only found 68. But what a job. And they found that people were contaminated from foodstuffs, but the water supply luckily remained uncontaminated. There is a report that you can get. You can download this report from the IAEA's fascinating reading. And there is another report from this group over here that said 60 deaths, 6,000 victims, and 20 years of neglect for the town of Goiânia, because it was basically ostracized. So citizens, of course, didn't want any radioactive material stored there, and they also didn't want the radioactive bodies to be buried in the cemetery, despite the fact they were safely buried, and they even threw stones when they were trying to bury the bodies. This summarizes the number of people that were tested and their dose levels. The red lines are the ones that died in hospital. The blue lines are the ones that were inpatient and were released and did not suffer ill effects. And the green lines are outpatient only. And you can see the number of persons that were tested. They're not big numbers despite what got out. This is the 6-year-old who died. I remember speaking to one of the Brazilians who was involved in this case, and he was actually here when she was in hospital. His story to me was she was running around like there was no problem with her until the day she died, and she just dropped dead. What a shame. She's been buried in this coffin, and they were trying to prevent that burial taking place. So there's Goiânia. Food and clothing were not accepted. Nothing that they made in Goiânia was accepted outside of the town. People that lived in Goiânia were often ostracized, refused accommodation if they said they were from Goiânia. They didn't want to have anything to do with these people. A lot of fear associated with this, unfortunately. Tomsk, a storage tank. This was in USSR. A storage tank exploded. It's up here. There's Tomsk. It's above Mongolia. And they released quite a bit of radioactivity. Again, about 4.3 terabecquerels. Activity was detected as far away as 120 kilometers, and nuclides that were released, and these are pictures of the area there. It could have been worse if the wind had been blowing in a different direction. We're at the mercy of the wind, actually, and the people that actually assisted in cleaning that up there and putting out the fire only got a couple of millisieverts. That's below background. Fukushima, first time a multi-unit facility was hit. 20,000 dead and missing from the earthquake and the tsunami. 1 dead from radiation. It was lung cancer. 3 others suffered some illness. So really 4 were affected by the radiation that got out from Fukushima. However, 50,000 homes destroyed, 560 square kilometers of land flooded. The Earth's rotation was actually increased 1.8 microseconds, and part of Japan moved 3 meters to the east. Very powerful earthquake. I'm sure you've all seen that picture. They thought the seawall would protect them. Well, it would have done if the tsunami had been smaller. And of course, this is some of the devastation that they got. The top left there is showing you the reactor fire from one of the units. If the backup generators hadn't been put in the basement and the tsunami came in and put them out, if they'd been up higher, we wouldn't have had this problem. So in a way, it was a design problem. So units 1 and 3 were at full power. They shut down automatically as they should. 4 to 6 were in shutdown already. We lost the off-site power, of course, because of the earthquake. The tsunami, as I just said, flooded the backup generators, and then that caused problems after the batteries ran out. The cooling was lost and the cores melted, and one of them, at least one of them, went up. This is misinformation that's out there on the internet, that the cores are going through the earth and contaminating everything. If you ever see anything like this, it's bullshit. They are well contained, so not a problem. More misinformation up here. This is showing a plume with doses, really high doses, coming across to the western coast of the USA. Again, that's more bullshit. But as you can see, a lot of damage and a lot of monitoring, including people's pets. So the little Yorkie is being tested for radiation over there. This is some accurate plume modeling showing where it went, and pretty much all of the radioactive material that came out of Fukushima blew out to the sea. It went into the Pacific Ocean, and to be glib, dilution is the solution to pollution. Well, not really, but it certainly worked in this case, because don't forget the half-life, of course, removes these things from the environment. An oddball here. In 2017 in Berlin, they found some playing cards that had been discarded. They were radioactive. They don't really know why they were radioactive. They were radioactive with iodine-129. Maybe somebody was trying to use radioactive marking on them to cheat. We don't actually know. They were quite heavily marked. Sorry, iodine-125. Doses to the players negligible, but again, a little bit of a mystery. There's another mystery here. Monitoring stations that are shown here with the stars picked up radioactivity, and it seemed to be coming from where that arrow's pointing. We don't know where the iodine-131 came from. We don't know who released it, but it got there somehow. So there was a release somewhere in the east. Collective dose is something that you might hear about. It's an outmoded quantity. I'll give you an example of how collective dose works. If I take 100 aspirin, it will kill me. If 100 people take 1 aspirin, one of them will die. That's collective dose. It's just bullshit. So sometimes you've got to be very careful. If you see collective dose used in something, be very cautious. The last thing I want to say is this study that came out and looked at lethality in various industries. So over 279 incidents with $41 billion of damages from those incidents. There were 182,000 deaths, most of them in the hydroelectric area. And the other here, you see the nuclear up there, there was 4,000 deaths, 3,000 in oil, almost 3,000 in coal, and 700 in natural gas. So the nuclear industry is not particularly hazardous compared to the other industries, especially not to hydroelectricity. But when we look at the damages, a little bit different. You can see the pie shape here now. The nuclear portion's quite significant, 16.6 billion compared to some of the others. In fact, it's the biggest segment. If radioactivity gets out into the environment, it can be a real problem to clean it up. And if you have questions, I would refer you to the Health Physics Society. No, I'm not taking questions here. We're out of time, actually. I would refer you to the Health Physics Society. That website, you can send questions in or find questions, answers to questions are there. And that brings me to the end of radiation accidents. And I'm out of time, so thank you so much. I will just say 2 other things. I will just say 3 other things. Tomorrow morning, all about dogs. In the afternoon, dog behavior workshop with the dog behavior expert. And if you see us around the ship anywhere, you have a dog behavior question, this is the one. If you have any science-related questions, see me. Thank you so much.
There will be 2 science cafes.
And there will be 2 science cafes where you can also ask questions in open forum. For those of you who like trivia, I'll be in here 8:30 tonight doing